If someone told you, "You don't belong here right in the middle of first class, under the stares of complete strangers," what would you do? Stay silent, get angry, or just smile, and wait for the world to reveal how small it really is? On an Eclipse Airways flight, when Harold Denton, an arrogant white businessman, threw those words at Lan Tran, an Asian woman calmly sitting in seat 1A, it all seemed like a simple misunderstanding. But just a few minutes later, the suspicious glances, the overly sweet tone of the flight attendant, and the so-called ticket recheck procedure turned the sky into an invisible courtroom where prejudice was the judge. If it were you being stared at like an intruder just because you don't look like you belong, would you get up and walk away, or stay and let justice speak in its own quiet way? Today, we're about to witness what happens when the person told they don't belong turns out to be the one who actually owns the entire plane. A story about intelligence, dignity, and the stunning reversal of justice. If you believe that sometimes silence can be the greatest strength of all, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe because this journey is about to begin. The sound of the jet engines echoed off the metal cabin walls, steady, dry, and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of a machine. Eclipse Airways flight EA709, New York to London, was about to close its doors. Outside the window, the sunset spilled across the silver wing, painting it a brilliant orange, a perfect moment of calm before the storm. In first class, the air carried the scent of new leather and fine wine. Everything was designed to whisper luxury, to remind you that you belonged to another class. Seats reclining 180 degrees, crisp white tablecloths, soft amber lighting grazing the confident faces of people certain of their place in the world. In seat 1A sat Lan Tran. Her seatbelt was fastened, her gaze fixed on the window. A light gray suit, hair neatly tied back, eyes calm and deep. No lipstick, no jewelry, no show. Only a small black notebook rested by her hand, the Eclipse Airways logo subtly engraved on its corner. 3 minutes before the cabin door closed, a middle-aged white man approached Harold Denton, a real estate investment executive well accustomed to being treated as someone important. He looked around, then stopped at seat 1A. A faint frown crossed his face almost instinctively. "Excuse me, miss, are you sure you're in the right seat?" Lan looked up, her voice calm and even. "No, my ticket says 1A. He gave her a look, not one of curiosity, but of appraisal. Then came a faint smile, half polite, half patronizing. "I just thought, someone like you doesn't really belong here." The cabin fell silent. The hum of the air conditioner became painfully clear. A few passengers looked up, their eyes searching for context, then landing on Lan's face, as if watching something out of place happen in their orderly little world. Lan said nothing. She looked at Harold, her gaze so steady that no one could tell if it was restraint or understanding. She gently closed her notebook, placed it neatly on the tray table, and leaned back. Silence. Not the silence of submission, but the silence of someone who knows they have nothing to prove. Harold's posture tightened. His eyes darted around, seeking validation. A woman in seat 1C gave a small nod, as if to say, "I thought so too." Lan didn't move. No explanation, no argument. Just that quiet, heavy gaze, the kind that could feel like judgment itself. The flight attendant, Olivia, walked over. Her smile textbook perfect from training. "Sir, is there a problem I can help with?" Harold chuckled lightly. "Oh, nothing serious. I just think she might be in the wrong seat. Would you mind checking?" The words polite on the surface dropped into the air like a drop of ink in clear water. Lan turned to Olivia, her voice soft but precise. "Would you like to check my ticket?" Olivia hesitated. A flicker of discomfort crossed her eyes. "Just to be sure, ma'am." The first-class cabin went completely still. People watched Lan as if she were a test one they didn't want to be part of. For a moment, Lan felt every gaze not hostile, but soaked in quiet suspicion disguised as civility. And in that moment, she wasn't angry. She simply thought, "They don't see me. They see the stereotype they've been taught to distrust." The scanner beeped. The ticket was valid. Olivia forced a smile. "Everything's in order. Thank you, ma'am." Harold shrugged, muttering just loud enough for others to hear. Sometimes, even systems make mistakes. The words drifted like air, yet left behind a chill that lingered. Lan said nothing. She opened her notebook again and wrote a single line. The plane began to taxi, but the air in the cabin still hadn't cleared. Conversations quieted. People avoided her eyes. A few pulled out their phones, pretending to be busy. Lan closed her eyes. No anger echoed in her mind, only a quiet question. Why do they believe that a seat determines a person's worth somewhere nearby? Someone looked at her differently, curious now, not judgmental. But they weren't brave enough to speak. Not yet. In that moment, prejudice had a shape. It didn't shout. It didn't threaten. It only needed a look, a smirk, or a simple, "Can we double-check that ticket?" the kind that sounded harmless. Lan understood. She knew the real storm hadn't started yet, and what she needed to do wasn't fight it, but stay still and let the truth reveal itself. But sometimes, silence makes those used to power think they're right. Just minutes later, before the captain could even announce takeoff, another additional procedure was introduced, and this time, it didn't come from a passenger. It came from the system itself. Suspicion had just found its official process. There are silences that make people uneasy, and there are those who, when they can't find fault in someone else, begin to doubt the silence itself. On that Eclipse Airways flight, the air in first class was still thick after Harold Denton's words. The plane hadn't even left the ground. Yet an invisible line had already been drawn between those who belonged and those who didn't. Harold looked over at Lan Tran. His eyes no longer held mere curiosity. They now carried something sharper, a challenge, laced with irritation that the order he believed in had been quietly disrupted. Lan remained still. Her hand rested lightly on her notebook, her breathing calm, her gaze unwavering. She didn't look like someone trying to prove herself or defend anything, and that very calmness only made Harold more uncomfortable. "Olivia," he called out, his voice thick with entitlement. "I think you should double-check this lady's ticket. I've seen system errors before. You understand." Flight attendant Olivia hesitated. The professional smile on her lips wavered. She knew Lan's ticket was valid. The digital scanner in her hand had confirmed it minutes ago. But the eyes Harold's and a few others nearby made her second-guess herself. "Just to make sure, sir," she said softly, then turned to Lan. "May I please see your ticket again?" Lan unlocked her phone and held up the digital boarding pass. The code was clear. Name Lan Tran, Seat 1A, Class First. Olivia glanced at it, then murmured, "I'll just rescan it in case the system glitched." Lan nodded slightly. No anger, no sarcasm, just a quiet nod, the kind that, to the observant, felt like a silent chance to correct a mistake. The scanner beeped again, louder this time. The screen read, "Valid ticket." Olivia swallowed hard. She knew she'd just done something unnecessary, yet felt oddly relieved. Because in that moment, following procedure felt safer than standing up for what was right. She said quietly. Her tone forced everything's correct. "Thank you, ma'am," Lan simply replied. "I know. Just 2 words yet." They dropped into the air with the weight of judgment. Harold turned his head, hiding his discomfort by adjusting his tie. "Machines fail sometimes," he muttered under his breath. "We can't always trust technology." Lan didn't answer, but in her eyes, that calm light seemed to strip away every ounce of falsehood from his excuse. Olivia walked away, shoulders heavy. She knew that, in that woman's eyes, she had just taken part in something quietly cruel. Not through words, but through action. An action by the book, yet wrong in every moral sense. Behind them, whispers began to stir. Maybe she got a promo ticket. Could be an airline employee. I wonder what she does to afford that seat. Each comment, small as it was, felt like an invisible needle. Lan heard everyone, but she sat still, eyes on the window, watching the wing glint in the fading light of dusk. A black man by the window glanced at her, his eyes different, not pitying, understanding. The kind of understanding shared only by those who've once been misplaced in the order of this world. Lan smiled faintly, a smile not meant for anyone else, but as a promise to herself she wouldn't let silence turn into complicity. Inside the cabin, the scent of expensive perfume mixed with the faint odor of fear. Fear of involvement, fear of being wrong, fear of being seen as different. That fear is what keeps prejudice alive, by making good people choose silence. Lan took a slow breath. She remembered years ago, when she helped build Eclipse Airways from the ground up, a company few knew she had co-founded. And she had made herself a promise if the day ever came when the system she helped create became unjust, she would not defend it. And now, sitting in the first-class cabin of her own airline, she saw that day arrive. No shouting, no hatred, just suspicion wrapped neatly in polite language. And that, she knew, was the most dangerous kind. Because prejudice today doesn't wear the face of open cruelty. It wears the mask of procedure, policy, precaution, and those who enforce it rarely think they're doing wrong. They're just doing their job. Moments later, Captain Ethan Ward appeared in the aisle, calm expression, voice firm with practiced authority. "I was told there was a small issue with the passenger in seat 1A. Olivia straightened up immediately, her voice trembling slightly. "Captain, it's all been verified now." Ethan nodded, glancing briefly at Lan. She smiled, gentle as a breeze. Their eyes met for just a few seconds, long enough for him to sense that something was off, though not yet enough to understand. He simply said, "Good. I just want to make sure everyone on board feels comfortable," Lan replied softly. "Thank you, Captain. I hope so too." The air in the cabin seemed to mend itself, at least on the surface. Laughter and chatter returned, but an invisible crack remained. Because everyone knew once suspicion has been spoken, it never truly disappears. Lan leaned back, closing her eyes. Oh, not to rest, but to hold on to her composure, the only weapon she would need for the rest of this flight. And in her mind, one quiet thought echoed, sometimes justice doesn't begin in a courtroom. It begins the moment you refuse to react the way they expect you to. But prejudice, once protected by a system, doesn't stop at an apology. And just minutes later, when Chief Flight Attendant Marcus entered holding a stack of documents, Lan knew the procedure had been activated. It was no longer the fault of individuals. It had become institutional, high above the ground. Eclipse Airways flight. EA 709 began to speed down the runway. But inside the first-class cabin, the air remained still. A sense of unease hung suspended, like a single note caught mid-symphony. Just when everyone thought the incident had passed, Marcus, the chief flight attendant, appeared. His uniform was perfectly pressed. His tie knotted at a precise angle. His smile measured to the millimeter, the kind of smile trained to hide every trace of emotion. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," he began smoothly. "I'm Marcus, the purser for today's flight. I've been informed of a small issue regarding ticket verification. We just need to make sure everything's properly in order before takeoff." The words floated softly through the air, yet carried the weight of institutional authority. Lan Tran looked up, calm and composed. "I've already been verified," she said. "Twice." Marcus bowed his head slightly, tone unwavering. "I understand, ma'am, but sometimes we're required to double-check just part of our standard procedure." A silence stretched between them. Harold Denton, the man who started it all, sat back smugly, a faint smirk on his face. To him, the moment felt like validation proof that he'd been right all along. After all, if the chief attendant had to intervene, there must have been something wrong. Lan's eyes met Marcus's, sharp as a blade behind her, calm. "Are you checking his ticket too?" Marcus froze for a split second. He glanced toward Harold, then back at her. "Ma'am, this is a general procedure." "General," Lan repeated softly, "meaning everyone's being checked equally." "Right," Marcus gave that polite, evasive smile, the one people use when there's no safe answer. "Yes, but we have to go one at a time, by regulation." "Then start with him," Lan said lightly, "since you're standing right next to his seat." The cabin went dead silent. A faint flush crept up Marcus's neck. Behind him, Olivia, the flight attendant, lowered her gaze to avoid Lan's eyes. Harold let out a small laugh, sipping his wine, pretending not to care. Lan said nothing more. She leaned back, her hand resting on that familiar black notebook, her gaze turning toward the window. Outside, the sky deepened to a grayish-violet. Her stillness unsettled everyone, because in that seat, most people would have shouted, protested, or stormed off, but she didn't. Marcus tried to steady himself, but his hand trembled slightly as he held the scanner. He knew this wasn't about tickets anymore. It was about conscience, and every eye in the cabin was on him, the eyes of prejudice, of guilt, of people afraid of being exposed. "Ma'am," he said softly, "if you'll just cooperate, this will only take a moment." Lan looked straight into his eyes. "I am cooperating," she replied quietly. "But are you sure this is for safety, or are you just afraid to displease someone?" The question didn't need an answer. It landed like a quiet blow. Marcus stepped back half a pace. Olivia gently touched his shoulder, signaling him to stop. "Marcus," she whispered, "I think we've done enough checks." Marcus nodded, turning toward the other passengers with a fragile smile. "My apologies, everyone, for the delay. We'll be taking off shortly." But that smile wasn't the same anymore. It carried a hairline crack, the kind that forms when someone realizes their professionalism has just been used to protect injustice. As Marcus walked away, Lan opened her notebook and began to write. She didn't record her emotions. She recorded facts, time, words, behavior, each detail, precise and deliberate the way only someone who once trained an entire airline staff could write. Harold noticed and raised an eyebrow. "You're taking notes now. I only said what I thought. There are rules everywhere, you know that." Lan smiled gently. "I know," she said. and I'm just observing how people use rules to disguise their bias." No one spoke after that. Only the sound of the landing gear retracting filled the air as the plane lifted off, carrying its cabin of silent witnesses into the clouds. From the back, whispers began again. "She's really composed. Maybe she's a lawyer. Listen to how she talks. No, she's probably some kind of executive." Lan heard them all and stayed silent, because she knew people often need to label someone before they decide to respect them. She didn't need them to know who she was. She only needed them to recognize what they had just done. A few minutes later, Marcus returned, his tone softer this time. "Ma'am, I apologize for the inconvenience earlier. Sometimes we have to do things that aren't pleasant." Lan tilted her head slightly, her expression kind but sad. "Not pleasant," she said quietly, "because you know it's wrong, but you still do it, right?" Marcus said nothing. For the first time, his polished smile vanished completely. "You know," Lan continued, her voice low but steady, "injustice doesn't just come from bad people. It comes from good people who are too afraid to lose their place." She stopped there. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, then lowered his eyes and quietly walked away. As the cabin lights dimmed for cruising altitude, Lan closed her eyes. The engines hummed steadily, but inside her, another sound stirred the sound of awareness, of purpose. She knew this wasn't over, because when procedure is used to excuse injustice, it stops being a mistake and becomes a flaw in the entire system. And just as she expected, that system didn't stay silent for long. Less than 10 minutes later, a soft chime echoed through the cabin. Marcus's voice came over the intercom. "Captain Ethan would like to see you at the front of the cabin, ma'am." Lan opened her eyes. She knew justice never comes easily, but this time it was about to make its entrance. Marcus's voice crackled through the intercom low, clipped and sharp. "She's in seat 1A. I'll handle it." The first-class cabin glowed in a soft golden hue, but the air felt cold enough to choke on. Outside, the plane had already left the ground. Yet inside, everyone remained trapped in an invisible turbulence, the kind born not of weather, but of prejudice made official. Marcus walked forward, his expression carefully neutral. The tablet in his hand glowed blue, with the Eclipse Airways logo, a symbol of authority that suddenly felt heavy. "Ms. Tran," he said evenly, "I need you to come with me to verify a few additional details." Lan looked up. The phrase wasn't new. She'd heard it 100 times before in operations meetings, but this time it was being used against her. Her voice was low, calm. "I've already verified. Twice. What else do you need from me?" Marcus swallowed hard. "This is the captain's request, ma'am. We just need to ensure all protocols are followed." "Protocol," Lan repeated softly. "Meaning you're asking a paying passenger with a valid ticket to leave her seat just to comfort those who feel uneasy seeing her sit here." The words weren't loud, but they sliced cleanly through the thin veil of professionalism. Marcus froze. Behind him, Olivia lowered her gaze. She knew this wasn't verification anymore. It was a sugar-coated removal. Around them, whispers started to ripple through the cabin. A white man a few rows back muttered, "If she's done nothing wrong, why not just go and get it over with?" A woman beside him replied, "It's just a procedure. Don't make a scene." Lan heard every word. She didn't turn. She didn't glare. She just kept her eyes on Marcus cold, steady, the eyes of someone who'd been misunderstood too many times, yet refused to react the way people expected. "Marcus," she said quietly, "the problem isn't me. Her words landed with the quiet weight of steel. The cabin went silent. No one dared meet her eyes. At the doorway, another attendant stood waiting. Marcus tilted his head, a silent cue. "This will only take a few minutes, ma'am," he said. "You understand, once everything's clear, you'll be able to return." Lan looked straight at him. "And if I go," she said, "they'll believe I was wrong. But if I stay, you'll have to face the truth that this procedure was built to protect someone else." She unbuckled her seatbelt, but didn't rise. The small gesture froze the entire cabin. Harold turned toward her, shrugging. "You're making everyone uncomfortable." You know that Lan turned her head slightly, her voice calm, precise. "If my presence makes you uncomfortable, maybe you should ask yourself why." No one spoke after that. The only sound was the engine hum through the window, steady, distant, like the heartbeat of a world pretending to be calm. Marcus's tone shifted, his voice tightening. "I don't want to do this, ma'am, but if you don't cooperate, I'll have to inform the captain." Lan smiled softly, almost like a period at the end of a sentence that had gone on too long. "You can do what you need to, and I'll do what I must." She lifted her phone, opening the camera. There was no anger in her eyes, only a quiet determination, the look of someone who knew that justice needed witnesses. Olivia saw the phone tremble slightly in Lan's hand, not from fear, but from resolve. And in that moment, she realized Lan was no longer the one being inspected. She was the one examining the entire system. The air thickened. Those who had whispered before now fell utterly silent. No one dared speak their thoughts, all clinging to the safety of silence. Because when injustice unfolds before you, what people fear most isn't the truth, it's being the only one to acknowledge it. Lan sat still. No defense, no resistance. Her calmness unsettled Marcus more than any argument ever could. "Ms. Tran," he said quietly, almost pleading, "please cooperate. I'm just following orders." Lan exhaled softly, her words almost a sigh. "I know, but it's because everyone keeps saying, 'just following orders,' that wrong things last so long." Harold looked away, hiding an uneasy smile. The woman beside him lowered her head. Olivia stepped aside, unable to meet Lan's gaze. And Marcus, he stood there, caught between two worlds. On one side, the captain's authority. On the other, the truth staring back at him. He knew he'd gone too far, but didn't have the courage to stop. Finally, he murmured, "I'll inform the captain." He turned away, his footsteps heavy as though something invisible was holding him back. Maybe it was conscience. Maybe it was the fear of facing himself once she was gone. Lan leaned back in her seat. The light from the window fell across her face, splitting it between shadow and gold like the thin line between justice and obedience. She didn't speak. She didn't need to, because sometimes silence alone is enough to make an entire system tremble. "In the cockpit," Marcus's voice came through the comm, trembling slightly. "Captain, the passenger in 1A refuses to leave her seat. I think you should come yourself." On the other end, Captain Ethan Ward exhaled deeply. He liked to think of himself as a fair man, but somewhere inside, he knew fairness isn't always the same as doing what's right. As the cockpit door opened, the captain's footsteps echoed down the aisle, slow, deliberate, carrying the confidence of someone who believed he could settle everything with neutrality. But what he didn't know was that, in that moment, as he approached Lan Tran, he wasn't just facing a passenger, he was about to confront the truth behind the very system he represented. The cabin door slid open, and Captain Ethan Ward appeared. His footsteps echoed steadily against the carpet, heavy, metallic, resonant in the pressurized air. The captain, the one who held absolute authority on the plane, was also a man who believed that every problem could be solved with composure and procedure. He stopped at row 1A. "Ma'am," he began, his tone measured, "I'm Captain Ethan Ward. I was told there's been a misunderstanding regarding your ticket." Lan Tran looked up, the light from above cast across her face, half bright, half shadow, as if the world itself was divided between power and truth. "It's not a misunderstanding, Captain," she replied calmly. "I've shown my ticket 3 times. Everything is valid." Ethan nodded once. "I understand. We just want to make sure that every passenger feels comfortable before we continue our flight." A quiet pause followed. Those words, "every passenger," sounded general, but they carried the full weight of collective bias, because everyone didn't really include her, the woman being doubted, isolated, and asked to prove she belonged. Lan's voice was calm, but it cut cleanly. "Comfortable? For whom?" "Captain." "For those who feel uneasy seeing me here, or for the person being asked to leave, even though she's done nothing wrong?" Ethan stiffened slightly. He wasn't used to questions like that. He was used to people deferring to his authority, to his neutrality. "I'm simply trying to clarify the situation," he said gently. "I'm not taking sides." Lan smiled faintly, a soft breath of irony. "And sometimes, not taking sides means you've already chosen the wrong one." The words rippled through the air like a cold wave. Olivia lowered her head. Marcus held his breath. Harold smirked that smug, self-assured grin of a man watching his prejudice being validated. No one else dared speak. Ethan looked down at the tablet Marcus handed him. On the glowing screen, the confirmation was clear. "Name Lan Tran seat, 1A class first status verified. Valid ticket." He nodded again, his voice slow and deliberate. "Everything seems fine. But, you understand, we just want to ensure everyone's comfort." Lan didn't respond right away. She looked at him not with defiance, but with the quiet understanding of someone who had once been in his position, aware of the weight of every word spoken from authority. "I understand perfectly, Captain," she said softly. "I used to use that phrase too, to ensure everyone's comfort, until I realized it was usually said to protect the people afraid of change." The cabin went still. Ethan froze, uncertain if what he'd just heard was criticism or reflection. The air seemed to thicken. Someone coughed, then fell silent again. Everyone was watching, as if witnessing a play they hadn't realized they were part of. Ethan placed the tablet down and spoke quietly. "Tran, please know that no one here intends to offend you. We're simply following procedure." "I know," Lan said, her voice low but steady. "And that's what makes it dangerous. Because when injustice wears the mask of procedure, people believe they're doing the right thing." Ethan said nothing. That sentence disarmed him more than any argument ever could. Harold broke in, his tone half annoyed, half performative. "She should step out so we can move on. Captain, we're already behind schedule." Ethan turned to respond, but Lan spoke first. "You're not delayed," she said evenly. "You're just uncomfortable that someone refuses to lower themselves to fit your comfort." Silence fell like a curtain. The only sound was the faint hum of the engines, whispering through the glass. Lan tilted her head slightly, her eyes locking with Ethan's. "Captain Ward, I've cooperated. I've stayed quiet. But now, what needs to be verified isn't my ticket. It's how you're using your authority." Ethan drew a slow breath. He looked at the woman before him, calm, composed, fearless, and for the first time, he realized that true power didn't come from rank, but from self-possession. Behind him, Marcus bowed his head. Olivia's gaze flickered toward Lan, silent, apologetic. Harold looked around for someone to agree with him, but no one did. A long, suspended moment passed as if the entire plane were frozen midair. Finally, Ethan exhaled and said quietly, "All right, no one needs to leave their seat. We'll continue our journey." The words seemed to end the standoff, but in truth, they only opened a deeper reckoning. Because even when power steps back, the wound left by prejudice remains. Lan didn't look at anyone. She opened her black notebook, wrote a single short line, and closed it again. A small action, yet to Marcus, it looked like a verdict being recorded by hand. Ethan walked away slowly, a weight in his chest. He had chosen neutrality, but neutrality had not cleansed the injustice. It had only made him a gatekeeper of silence. Lan leaned back in her seat, breathing out softly, not from exhaustion, but from resolve, because she knew sometimes to reclaim justice. You don't have to shout, you just have to stay. But justice never sleeps in silence. As the plane glided through the dim light of dawn, another voice rose this time, not from the crew, but from the very man who had started it all. Harold Denton leaned over with a thin smile and said, "Maybe you really are in the wrong seat after all." Lan opened her eyes, looking at him not with anger, but with the calm certainty of someone who knows it's time for justice to finally speak. Dawn was seeping through the airplane windows, tinting the first-class cabin in a soft, honey-colored light. No one spoke for a long time. Only the steady hum of the engines filled the silence, like the heartbeat of a crowd trying to stay calm after surviving a storm made of quiet. Then Harold Denton leaned slightly toward her, his voice rough from lack of sleep, laced with arrogance and smug certainty. "Maybe you're in the wrong seat." No one looked surprised. The words came out as lightly as a breath, yet they carried the weight of a century of prejudice and privilege, the kind of entitlement that makes people feel safe only when they've diminished someone else. Lan Tran turned her head. The morning light angled across her face. No anger, no shock, just an unwavering stillness. "You mean," she asked softly, "first class isn't for people like me?" Her tone was low, calm, but it was enough to make the entire cabin pause. Harold recoiled slightly, unprepared for her composure. He'd been waiting for an outburst for anger, for a reaction that would prove him right to suspect her. But Lan gave him none of that. She just looked at him, a look without weapons, yet strong enough to make him feel small. Harold gave a short, bitter laugh. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. You don't fit here. I have the right to express how I feel. Don't I?" Lan nodded slightly. "Of course. And I have the right to record what you say. Then, without a word." She unlocked her phone, opened the camera, and set it neatly on the tray table. No threat, no defiance. Just one simple movement, but it froze the entire cabin. Olivia, the young flight attendant, startled, her hands tightening around the service tray. Marcus stood at the end of the aisle, watching, and from the cockpit doorway, Captain Ethan Ward looked on in silence. Harold scoffed. "What? You're recording me now?" "Trying to scare me." Lan's voice was calm, almost conversational. "No, I just want evidence. In places like this, words can be twisted easily." She paused, then added quietly, "Especially when they come from people like me." The cabin fell utterly silent. A man behind them adjusted his glasses, avoiding her gaze. A middle-aged white woman lowered her head over a magazine she clearly wasn't reading. Lan set the phone down, letting it record openly. She sat upright, hands resting neatly on her knees, eyes straight ahead, not challenging, not afraid. This was no longer the silence of submission. It was the silence of intention, the kind that bears witness to truth. Harold began to fidget. "You planning to post that online? You can't film me without permission." Lan didn't blink. "You have the right to speak," she said evenly, "and I have the right to document it. We both have rights. The difference is how we use them." A ripple of energy moved through the cabin. No one dared speak, but in a few faces, something shifted, a flicker of empathy. Faint but real, that quiet recognition that comes when someone stands up, not with anger, but with clarity. Marcus approached cautiously, trying to mediate. "Ma'am, perhaps it would be best to stop recording just to avoid further misunderstandings." Lan turned to him, her gaze gentle. "You're right. I want to avoid misunderstandings, too. That's exactly why I'm recording, so everyone can see the same truth." Marcus froze. He realized she was no longer the passenger being managed. She was the one in control, with calm, with intellect, and with a truth no one could distort anymore. Ethan stepped forward, ready to intervene, but Lan lifted a hand slightly. "It's all right, Captain. I don't want any trouble. I just want people to see that sometimes. The issue isn't the procedure. It's how we choose to see one another." Her voice was soft, but it carried through the stillness, reaching everyone who had the courage to listen. Harold looked around, meeting the eyes of a few passengers. No one smiled back. What he saw instead was silence, not of support, but of quiet judgment. He turned away, trying to look composed, but his hand clenched tightly on the armrest. For the first time, the power he'd always relied on no longer protected him, because power only works when others are afraid. And Lan wasn't. The sunlight caught the edge of her phone and reflected into her eyes. It was the light of awareness, the kind that shines not through shouting, but through understanding and evidence. Lan spoke softly, almost to herself. "Maybe sometimes, to change the world, you don't need to argue. You just need to let people see themselves in the mirror." Marcus bowed his head, like someone who just learned a painful truth. Olivia turned away, her eyes glassy with tears she didn't fully understand. Ethan stood still, caught between guilt and awakening. And Harold stared out the window, where sunlight spread slowly through the cabin light. He could not stop, no matter how hard he tried. But sometimes, when truth is revealed, the crowd doesn't awaken, they turn away. Because accepting the truth means admitting they've been silent for far too long. And as the plane continued its flight, the glances in first class began to shift. They no longer looked at Harold. They looked at Lan Tran, the woman who now carried a new kind of guilt, the guilt of having the courage to speak. As sunlight poured through the airplane windows, spreading softly across the brown leather seats of first class, Eclipse Airways. Flight EA 709 glided quietly at 30,000 feet. Inside, no one spoke, but silence sometimes is louder than any argument. Ever since Lan Tran had turned on her camera and recorded Harold Denton's words, the air in the cabin had changed. The tension was no longer sharp. It had become a slow, suffocating discomfort, a quiet unease that made people glance at each other, seeking allies in their eyes, as if they were all sitting in a courtroom without knowing who the judge was and who the accused. The first voice to pierce the quiet came from a man in seat 2C. He muttered just loud enough for others to hear, "It was just a small misunderstanding." Why is she making such a big deal out of it? A woman behind him replied, her voice soft but sharp as glass. She's filming. On a plane. Who does that? I've flown Eclipse for 10 years, never seen something like this. Whisper by whisper. The words slithered through the cabin. No one spoke to Lan, but everyone spoke about her. Every hushed sentence became part of an unspoken verdict, passed before the trial had even begun. Harold leaned back in his seat, the corner of his mouth curling upward. His glance slid over to her as if to say, "See, they all agree with me." Lan sat still. Her phone rested on the tray table. Camera recording, its tiny red light flickering like a lone spark in a room full of shadows. Olivia, the young flight attendant, approached quietly, setting down a glass of water. Her voice trembled slightly. "Ma'am, maybe you should turn the camera off. People are starting to feel uncomfortable." Lan looked up, offering a faint smile. "I understand. But if the truth makes them uncomfortable, then the problem isn't the camera." Olivia said nothing. In her eyes flickered something like shame, not because Lan was wrong, but because she knew she herself was more afraid of the crowd than of being unjust. Captain Ethan Ward hadn't yet returned to the cockpit. He stood at the doorway, watching. From where he stood, everything looked stable, no shouting, no chaos. But beneath that fragile calm was a miniature society, one that preferred fake order over real justice. Then Harold raised his voice, loud enough for the entire cabin. "We paid to fly in peace, not to sit through someone's personal protest." A few nodded. Others stayed silent, the quiet kind of agreement that spreads like a tide. Slow but steady. Lan didn't respond. She gazed out the window, where the clouds stretched endlessly like fields of white. She'd once thought the sky was the freest place on earth, but now she realized that even up here, prejudice travels too. A black man at the back of the cabin looked at her briefly, an unspoken glance of understanding before turning away. He knew better than to get involved. In places like this, silence was survival. Minutes passed, and the air grew thicker. Marcus approached her again, voice soft but tense. "Ms. Tran, if you allow it, we'd like to stop the recording. Some passengers are feeling threatened." Lan looked at him, her tone almost a whisper. "Do you see the irony?" Marcus: "They weren't threatened when someone insulted me, only now, when the truth is being recorded." Marcus had no answer. She didn't blame him. She knew people often don't choose what's right. They just choose the side with more people on it. Olivia returned to the galley, her hands trembling. She wanted to say something, but courage was still a luxury. Harold, emboldened by the murmurs of support, leaned forward again, now fully stepping into his favorite role. "The victim. If you want attention," he said. Half sneer, half defense. "Maybe try somewhere else. This is a flight, not a courtroom." Lan smiled. "You're right. But sometimes," she said softly, "what happens in silence is the real testimony." Her words dropped like a pebble in still water, but the ripples reached every seat. Someone coughed. Someone adjusted their headphones. Someone flipped a magazine, all pretending to be busy, all running from the truth. And there she sat, Lan Tran alone, among the civilized. No one touched her, yet isolation had shape and weight. It lived in the averted glances, the quickened breaths, the rustling of paper meant to cover an unbearable quiet. If this were a courtroom, Lan would have been the accused not for doing wrong, but for disturbing the comfort of prejudice. At the back of the cabin, Captain Ethan Ward kept watching. He saw what most others didn't. She wasn't fragile. She was simply holding her calm in the middle of a storm made of judgment. When the intercom chimed, announcing their approach to the connecting point, someone muttered just loud enough for her to hear, "They'll probably flag her name now. Put her on a watch list." Lan didn't react. She knew this was how crowds punish people, not with violence, but with rumor. And sometimes, rumors destroy more deeply than any sentence. She quietly opened her black notebook and wrote a single line. "It's not loneliness that exhausts us, but having to prove the obvious to those who refuse to see." She closed the book. In the dim light, her face was calm, almost serene, as if she'd accepted that justice, before it's heard, must first pass through solitude. But even in silence, some hearts begin to crack open. As the plane trembled gently, a woman rose from the back row, middle-aged, with warm brown skin and steady eyes. Her voice was clear, unwavering. She didn't do anything wrong. And if any of us stay silent, we're letting what's wrong continue. It was Angela Price, a human rights lawyer, a stranger to Lan Tran, but one she would never forget. The engines hummed steady, distant, cold, like the heartbeat of a body trying to stay calm in the middle of a silent storm. Lan Tran still sat there alone in first class, surrounded by polished leather and quiet hostility. Every glance that landed on her was a silent indictment. And then, in the moment when even silence seemed to weigh too much, another voice rose, and not loud, not trembling, clear, every word placed down with the precision of courage. "She hasn't done anything wrong." All heads turned toward the back of the cabin. Standing there was Angela Price, a middle-aged black woman, her hair neatly coiled, her eyes bright and unwavering, her voice carrying the gravity of someone who had fought for fairness too many times to still be afraid. She removed the boarding pass clipped to her jacket, showing her name, Angela Price, human rights attorney, and I'm saying this as a passenger if anyone tries to remove her from this plane. You are violating federal anti-discrimination law. The air cracked like a pane of glass struck by a fingertip. Harold blinked, momentarily stunned. Marcus froze. Olivia exhaled shakily as if someone had finally loosened a knot around her chest. Captain Ethan Ward, still by the doorway, looked at Angela with a mix of surprise and respect. No one had expected that. After so much silence, truth would come from a stranger. Angela began walking forward, slow, deliberate steps. Her voice wasn't raised, but every word landed with perfect clarity. We're 30,000 feet in the air, but justice doesn't fly higher than the truth. A woman with a valid ticket is being questioned because she doesn't look like first class. And you think silence makes you innocent? No one answered. Her eyes swept the cabin from one guilty face to another. "I saw your looks," she said. "The looks of people who tell themselves they're not involved. But silence in the face of wrong is complicity." Harold drew a breath, forcing out a protest. "You don't know the situation." She was filming people, disrupting the flight. Angela met his gaze calm, sharp, precise as a blade slicing through illusion. "Oh, I know exactly what's happening here. Recording the truth isn't disruption. Disruption is when privilege convinces itself it can decide where others belong." A white man in the front row, who'd been pretending to read, slowly nodded. A woman beside him lowered her magazine, eyes softening. The entire cabin shifted not because of turbulence, but because of a moral tremor running beneath their seats. Lan stayed still, her eyes following Angela. For the first time since the flight began, she wasn't alone at the center of the storm. Her lips curved slightly, not in gratitude, but in recognition. The nod she gave was quiet, solemn, and full of respect. Angela turned to Marcus and Ethan. By regulation, she said, if a passenger is treated unfairly due to race or gender, this airline can face a discrimination suit. I have more than enough grounds to file one the moment we land. But I trust you'd rather not let it come to that. Marcus lowered his head. His voice came out small, almost childlike. I was just following procedure. Angela's reply was gentle, but unflinching. Procedure is no excuse for injustice. It only means something when guided by conscience. The cabin went utterly still. The only sound was her heels tapping softly against the floor as she returned to her seat. No one else spoke. Even Harold turned away, trying to hide his discomfort behind feigned indignation. Ethan straightened his posture, as though a weight had been lifted from his chest. "Thank you, Mrs. Price," he said quietly. "We'll make sure this never happens again." Angela didn't look at him. She rested a hand on her seat and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "I didn't speak up to be thanked. I spoke up because if we don't, silence will always win." Lan turned her gaze to the window. The sky outside stretched wide and blindingly clear, but the light she felt now didn't come from the sun. It came from the courage of a single voice that had refused to stay quiet. For the first time on this flight, she didn't feel alone. A young man 2 rows back spoke, his tone hesitant but sincere. "She's right. The lady didn't do anything wrong." Another voice followed. "We all saw what happened. Let's not pretend we didn't." The silence began to fracture like ripples spreading from a stone tossed into a still lake. Lan nodded softly. No one noticed. But inside her, a new chapter of justice had begun, not written by authority, but spoken through solidarity. Ethan signaled for Marcus to return to the cockpit, then turned toward Lan, bowing his head slightly. "Ms. Tran," he said, "I apologize for what's happened. We'll continue our journey, and I promise there won't be any further incidents." Lan's voice was calm, steady, but her words cut deep. "I hope your apology isn't just for this flight, Captain, but for the system that made it possible." Ethan froze, because he understood this was no longer about one passenger. It was an indictment of a culture built on silence. Angela sat down again, her hand resting on a small notebook on her lap. No one knew, but inside it were hundreds of similar stories, moments when she'd had to stand up in rooms where silence was considered politeness. And today, she knew that one voice, spoken at the right time, could tip the scales of justice. Just as the cabin began to settle, the intercom crackled. "Captain to cabin crew security requested. Please remain seated while we verify passenger information." Marcus froze. Ethan's face drained of color. Angela's eyes lifted, cold and sharp. And Lan, she only exhaled softly, as if she'd expected this all along. "Sometimes," she murmured, "when truth is finally spoken, the system's first instinct is to silence it." The intercom crackled through the cabin, its tone cold and precise. "We are temporarily pausing takeoff preparations. Air Marshal security personnel are boarding to verify an issue involving a passenger." A wave of silence swept across first class. No one looked at anyone else, but everyone knew. They all knew what was coming. Lan Tran slowly set her notebook down on her lap and lifted her head. There was no shock in her eyes, only a quiet exhale, the kind that belongs to someone who's seen this pattern before, who's tired of watching the same script replay itself. 2 air marshals entered the cabin, dark navy uniforms, crisp steps, the golden emblem on their chests glinting beneath the soft cabin lights. One spoke, his voice firm but not harsh, ma'am. We've received a request for assistance from the captain. Please bring your identification and come with us for verification. The air stilled. Captain Ethan Ward stood just behind them, face calm but breath heavy. Harold watched, a thin smile curling on his lips, the smug expression of a man convinced that power had just chosen his side. Lan tilted her head slightly, her tone steady, almost gentle. Verification. I thought we already did that. The second marshal replied. We're just following protocol. Ma'am, it'll only take a moment. We're just following orders. Old words cold, familiar, and echoing with the ghosts of every mistake history refused to learn from. Lan stayed silent for a few seconds. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small leather wallet. No one moved. Ethan watched. Marcus watched. Olivia held her breath. Only Harold muttered under his breath, low enough for those near him to hear, "Finally, right place, right time." Lan turned to him, not angry, not smiling, just one calm, steady look, the kind that makes a man realize he's just awakened something far bigger than himself. From her wallet, she withdrew a cream-colored business card, its letters embossed in silver. Dr. Lan Tran, Chief Executive Officer, Eclipse Airways. She handed the card to the marshal, her voice composed and deliberate. I don't believe you need to escort me anywhere. You can simply inform Captain Ethan Ward that I'm the one who authorized the very security protocols you're now carrying out. The room broke open as if all the air had been sucked out at once. Marcus froze. Olivia dropped a glass onto the carpet. It shattered softly, unnoticed. Harold went still, his mouth opening, but no sound came out. And Ethan stood like a man who had just realized he wasn't the highest authority in the room, not even close. The marshal stared at the card, uncertain. You're the CEO of Eclipse Airways. Lan nodded lightly. Yes, and this aircraft operates directly under my supervision. Ethan's voice cracked as he finally spoke. You didn't know. I thought. Lan interrupted him gently. I know. You thought you were following protocol, but protocol is just a frame. And today, you let prejudice fill that frame. The cabin fell into an absolute painful silence. No one dared to meet her eyes anymore, not out of fear of her position, but out of shame. The kind of shame that comes from realizing you chose the easy side, the wrong side, simply because it was safer. Angela Price, the human rights lawyer who had spoken up earlier, looked toward Lan, her eyes shining with a mix of admiration and sorrow. She understood that what had just happened wasn't victory. It was revelation, a mirror held up to an entire system. Harold's hand trembled. His voice broke. Barely a whisper. I didn't know. Lan looked at him, her expression soft, almost sad. No, you didn't. And sometimes, not knowing is the very excuse people use to keep hurting one another. Ethan turned to the marshals, his voice subdued. There's no need for further verification. The situation is clear. One of the marshals nodded. Yes, Captain. And both men withdrew quietly, leaving behind a cabin too ashamed to breathe. Lan faced Ethan. I never wanted to humiliate anyone, she said. I only wanted to see how people would respond when faced with injustice. Ethan bowed his head, voice rough with regret. I'm sorry, Dr. Tran. Not just for what I did, but for how long I've been silent about things like this. Lan nodded gently. I accept your apology, but don't apologize to me. Apologize to yourself for forgetting who you were supposed to be. Olivia began to cry softly. Marcus clenched his fists. fighting the urge to hide. And Harold stared at the floor, his hands trembling like brittle paper. Every mask in that cabin, the mask of politeness, of procedure, of professional duty, fell away all at once. Outside the window, the sky was still clear. The plane hadn't even taken off. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. Lan didn't speak again. She simply reopened her black notebook and wrote one clean line. When true power reveals itself, all pretense bows. Then she closed it, her lips curving into the faintest smile, not of triumph, but of quiet understanding. Justice doesn't need to shout. It only needs to exist. As Marcus stepped out of the cabin, he whispered into his headset, "Get Nathan Brooks, the co-founder. He needs to know what just happened." Ethan remained standing, his eyes fixed on Lan, his voice low, a confession more than a statement. "There are lessons they don't teach in any training manual, and I just failed one of them." The plane sat motionless on the runway. No roar of engines, no chatter, no movement, just the golden wash of midday light filtering through the windows, brushing across the faces of everyone in first class. Faces that had just witnessed a reversal faster and sharper than any shift in the air. No one laughed. No one whispered. All that remained was a silence heavy enough to feel the silence of people realizing they'd been standing on the wrong side all along. Lan Tran stayed in her seat, arms folded, beside her. The ivory business card with the word CEO, Eclipse Airways, lay neatly on the tray table. Everything was now clear. No explanation required. Captain Ethan Ward still stood at the cabin doorway. He didn't look like a commander anymore, more like a student waiting for his final grade. Marcus lingered behind him, fists clenched, eyes lowered to the carpet as if searching for an escape. And Harold Denton, the man who had said, "You don't belong here," sat frozen, his face twisted between panic and shame. Lan quietly took out her phone, not to record but to call. She dialed a number by memory, her fingers moving without hesitation. After 2 rings, a calm, deep male voice answered Lan. "What's going on?" She spoke evenly. No anger, no defense, just calm control, Nathan. "I'm on flight EA709. I need you to confirm something." The cabin held its breath. Only the faint hiss of wind outside and the pounding of hearts filled the space. Ethan took half a step forward, then froze when he heard the name. Nathan Brooks, co-founder and CEO of Eclipse Airways, a legend in the aviation industry. A man Ethan had only ever seen in internal memos, never expecting to hear from like this. Lan pressed speaker. Nathan's voice filled the cabin, deep, steady, and carrying the unmistakable weight of authority. "Ethan Ward, are you currently commanding flight EA709? Ethan swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." "Good. Then let me make something very clear. The woman you and your crew decided to verify is Dr. Lan Tran, the founder of the very airline you're flying for. And you've just failed your first test in ethics." No one moved. Each word landed like the echo of a judge's gavel. Lan remained still, her face unreadable, detached, as if the situation had already moved beyond her. But the others couldn't hide. Marcus turned pale. Olivia looked away, tears pooling in her eyes. Harold bowed his head, trembling, stripped of the last illusion of superiority he'd been clinging to. Nathan's voice came again, steady and cold. "Ethan, when we appointed you as captain, we didn't just test your flying skills. We tested your character, your ability to treat people with respect. We wanted to know what you'd do if you ever had to choose between procedure and principle. And today, you chose wrong." Ethan opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Finally, he managed a hoarse whisper. I'm sorry. I didn't realize you didn't realize, Nathan interrupted, because you didn't want to see. You saw an Asian woman, dressed simply, and assumed she didn't belong in first class. That's how bias works. It blinds you while convincing you you're still clear-eyed. No one dared to breathe. Even Harold's breathing came out in short, broken bursts. Nathan continued, voice still low but now edged with conviction. I'm not singling you out. Ethan, the truth is, our whole system needs reflection. But I want everyone in that cabin crew and passengers alike to remember this. The people who think they hold power are often the ones being tested by it. The words hit like cold air against raw skin. This was no longer a personal reprimand. It was a moral reckoning. Lan closed her eyes for a moment. No smile, no gloat, just a quiet breath, the sound of release. Thank you, Nathan, she said softly. That's enough. Nathan's tone gentled. Lan, finish the flight. I'll take care of the rest when you land. And thank you for reminding me that our tests still matter. The line clicked off, but the silence that followed carried the weight of an entire awakening. Ethan stepped toward Lan and bowed his head low. I'm sorry, Dr. Tran. I don't know what else to say. Lan met his eyes, her voice calm as water. I believe you, and I believe that after today, you'll never not know again. Ethan nodded, eyes rimmed red. He turned to his crew, his tone quiet but resolute. No one leaves the cabin. No one speaks another word. From this moment on, we have one task: relearn what respect means. Angela Price inclined her head, her gaze soft yet firm. She understood this was one of those rare moments when true power bowed to conscience, not because it was forced to, but because it finally saw. Harold stayed seated, fingers laced, eyes fixed on the floor. The man who had once shouted with certainty now sat crumbling in silence, his downfall quiet and complete. Like a sandcastle meeting the tide, Marcus whispered, voice shaking. Tran, we were wrong. Lan nodded gently. Being wrong is human, but how you face it, that's what defines you. Some passengers who had stayed silent, or worse, complicit, now looked at her differently. Their eyes no longer held suspicion, but a mix of respect and guilt. Angela leaned closer, her voice low. They needed to see this, because justice doesn't always come from the courtroom. Sometimes it comes from a cabin at 30,000 feet. Lan smiled faintly, or from one person brave enough to say what's right, even if they stand alone. Outside, the runway lights flicked back to green. Ethan returned to the cockpit. Lan reopened her black notebook and wrote one final line. When true power arrives, pretense collapses, but truth doesn't humiliate, it heals. She closed the notebook, her expression serene. Flight EA 709 began to roll forward. But inside, no one felt like they were taking off. It felt instead like they were finally landing after a long journey through darkness. And in that quiet, Lan whispered, now, it's time for justice to speak. The air in first class still trembled with the aftershock of that call. Captain Ethan Ward walked back toward the cockpit, every step heavy as though he were stepping across the remains of his own pride. Marcus hovered near the doorway, avoiding Lan's gaze. Olivia quietly gathered the silver tray with trembling hands, though no one had asked her to, and Lan Tran sat there calm, composed, untouched by the turbulence that had just shaken everyone else. She didn't look up. Her voice was quiet, almost gentle. Let's begin. We can't take off until what's broken is fixed. The words were soft, but they carried weight, not the weight of authority, but of moral command. Ethan stopped and turned. Dr. Tran, what would you like me to do? Lan finally looked at him. Her eyes had softened, no longer sharp with defiance, but deep and still, like water after a storm. It's not what I want, Ethan. It's what you already know you need to do. He drew in a long breath, then turned to Marcus. Announce a flight delay. Notify operations control. Marcus nodded, his hand shaking slightly as he keyed the radio. A short, metallic beep followed a small, simple sound that somehow marked the beginning of a new order. Lan rose from her seat. No one moved to stop her. Her steps were slow, deliberate, yet every one of them made the cabin feel smaller. When she reached Harold Denton's row, she stopped. The man who once sneered, "You don't belong here," now sat hunched over, hands clasped tight, eyes fixed on the floor. Lan stood there for a moment before she spoke, her voice low. "Steady, Mr. Denton. I don't fault you for not knowing who I am, but I do fault you for believing you had the right to decide someone's worth based on their skin or how they look." Harold tried to speak, but his apology died in his throat. Lan continued, her tone even, without cruelty. "As of today, you are permanently banned from all Eclipse Airways flights, not as revenge, but as responsibility. We cannot allow prejudice to board our planes and call it travel." The cabin went still. No one protested. No one whispered. Only the sound of awareness settling in the kind that leaves no room for denial. Harold's shoulders sagged. No one pitied him, yet no one celebrated either, because everyone understood this wasn't punishment. It was justice, measured and precise. Lan turned to Marcus and Olivia. Her gaze was neither harsh nor forgiving. It was instructive. "Marcus, Olivia, you'll both be temporarily suspended to attend retraining in customer relations and cultural sensitivity, not to take your jobs away, but to give you a chance to earn them back. Next time, I want you to see people, not profiles." Marcus lowered his head. His voice broke slightly. I understand." Olivia's eyes filled, her voice trembling. "Thank you, Dr. Tran." Lan only nodded. She didn't need gratitude because real justice doesn't ask to be praised. It simply asks to be done. Ethan watched, the weight of everything settling on him, not fear, but the ache of humility. He stepped closer, voice low. "Dr. Tran, do you want me to resign?" Lan studied him for a moment, then asked softly, "I don't want that, but I want you to ask yourself if this were a test. Would you have the courage to grade yourself honestly?" He stood silent for a long while. Then, quietly, "I'll report to the board myself. If they decide I'm unfit, I'll step down." Lan nodded. "That's enough. No one's forcing you to leave. But remember, some flights can only take off once the pilot learns to see every passenger equally. From the back." Angela Price's voice carried forward calm, clear, proud. "I've never seen anyone use power with such grace. Thank you for everyone who's ever had to walk off a plane in silence because no one stood up for them." Lan turned, smiling gently. "And thank you for being the first to break that silence." Two women, one who spoke, one who acted, met each other's gaze across the aisle. In that instant, justice was no longer abstract. It was alive, breathing between them. Ethan lifted the cabin mic, his voice trembling slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay, but we also want to thank you for witnessing something every system needs a reminder of how we're meant to treat one another." No applause followed, but many nodded quietly. A middle-aged white man who had stayed silent the entire time murmured, "This is the first time I've seen justice served," without anyone raising their voice. Lan sat back down, gazing out the window. The sky was still blue, but clearer now, somehow lighter, not because the light had changed, but because people had. She opened her black notebook and wrote one final line. Justice doesn't seek revenge. It repairs by giving everyone the chance to return to the right side of dignity. She closed the book and set it gently on the table, her eyes calm and far away. Transition to Part 12. Aftermath and Reform. The intercom crackled again, clearance granted for takeoff. Ethan returned to the cockpit. Marcus followed silently. Lan leaned back, eyes closed. She knew this flight would soon land, but the moral turbulence it created would keep rippling long after, through boardrooms, news feeds, and newly awakened hearts. Justice, she thought, doesn't end in the sky. It has to touch the ground and change how we fly together. 3 days after Flight EA-709, the Eclipse Airways headquarters in New York was cloaked in silence. Morning light glinted off the mirrored glass towers so clear that anyone walking past could see their own reflection. Perhaps that was exactly what the company needed most now to finally look at itself. On the 47th floor, Dr. Lan Tran sat behind a dark wood desk. In front of her lay a thick report labeled simply EA-709 Incident Report, Behavioral Review and System Reform. No words like disciplinary action or punishment appeared on the cover because Lan had never believed justice was born from punishment, but from forcing people to face the truth. She read each line carefully, her face calm, with no trace of vindication. That flight, she knew, had changed far more than just one bad workday. It had exposed a fracture the aviation industry and society itself had long hidden beneath polite smiles. That afternoon, the board convened an emergency session. The glass-walled conference room overlooked the restless city below, but inside, the air was heavy. Nathan Brooks, co-founder and CEO, sat at the head of the table, eyes fixed on the large screen displaying Lan's report. He began, "We're not here to talk about brand image today. We're here to talk about dignity, because once that's lost, no airline can ever take off again." Silence. Lan sat beside him, saying nothing. She simply observed like someone who knew truth didn't always need a defender, only a witness. Nathan read aloud from the report's conclusion. Captain Ethan Ward directly responsible for mishandling the situation. Though he displayed no overt discrimination, he allowed unconscious bias to shape his judgment and failed to protect the passenger who was targeted. Result: immediate termination. Ethan's photo appeared on the screen, tired but unflinching. He had already issued a public apology. Yet Lan knew some mistakes couldn't be repaired with words, only with the weight of consequence. Nathan continued. Marcus Green, lead attendant, demoted, and required to complete 6 months of mandatory ethics retraining. Olivia Moore, flight attendant, suspended for 30 days with required recertification in cultural sensitivity. The room sank into a heavier quiet. Lan didn't interrupt. She knew they weren't villains, just people shaped by a system that had mistaken bias for procedure, and the only way to save them was to help them see themselves through a clearer lens. Then Nathan moved to the final name, Harold Denton, passenger, businessman, initiator of the incident, permanently banned from Eclipse Airways and all global partner carriers. Any passenger found guilty of discriminatory behavior will face behavioral review before future booking. A board member hesitated. "Isn't that too harsh?" Lan turned toward him, her tone calm, deliberate. "No, because justice isn't punishment, it's warning. When prejudice is tolerated, it flies higher than ethics, and when that happens, no one is safe." The room froze. No one objected. They all knew she wasn't speaking as the wrong party, but as someone safeguarding the company's moral altitude. The report was approved that same day. Ethan left the company quietly. Marcus and Olivia accepted their sanctions and began retraining. And Harold Denton, the man who once called himself a first-class customer, received a short official letter. Permanent flight ban, effective September 12th. No rebuke. No dramatics, just one closing line. Dignity knows no class. That evening, Lan stayed alone in her office, below. The city glowed like a living map of humanity, brilliant, yet dotted with shadows still waiting for light. She opened her laptop and typed the final entry in her private journal. If justice is only an emotion, it fades like a passing storm. But if it becomes a principle, it will live within us, like the air that keeps an airplane aloft. She closed the laptop and looked out at the calm horizon. Thin clouds drifted by, serene, as if the world itself had been washed clean by a long rain of awareness. The next morning, Nathan Brooks sent an official company statement to all staff and media outlets. Eclipse Airways failed to uphold its core value, respect for human dignity. Effective immediately, every employee from pilot to ground crew will participate in anti-bias integrity training. An independent ethics committee will oversee all reports of discriminatory behavior. Dignity is no longer a slogan, it is our operating standard. The statement ended with a single line written by Lan herself. We can't control the wind, but we can choose our direction. The phrase spread quickly across social media, not because it came from a CEO, but because people saw themselves in it sometimes as the victims, sometimes as the silent ones who had looked away. Later, in a quiet follow-up meeting, Nathan asked her if you could go back. Would you want that flight not to happen? Lan paused, thoughtful. I wouldn't wish for it to happen, she said softly. But without it, we might still believe we've been flying the right way. Nathan nodded, respect in his eyes. He understood what had seemed like the company's darkest moment was actually the dawn of a new moral compass. 3 weeks later, a passenger uploaded a short clip from Flight EA-709. The footage of Lan Tran calmly confronting prejudice spread like wildfire. Media outlets called it the justice in the sky moment. And from a small hashtag, raw respect in flight, a movement began to take shape. Not to glorify anyone, but to remind the world justice can only exist when human dignity is protected even in the smallest, most confined spaces we share. 3 weeks after Flight EA-709, a short video barely 3 minutes long appeared online. No one knew who uploaded it. It simply showed the first-class cabin, a calm Asian woman sitting still amid a storm of prejudice, while the world around her seemed to collapse under the weight of its own silence. The video was titled simply, When Dignity Speaks, Respect in Flight. Within one night, the hashtag soared to the top of Youku trends. Then it spread to Europe, then to Asia. People weren't talking about an airline anymore. They were talking about a human moment. News outlets lit up with headlines. CEO insulted on her own airline. The woman who taught the aviation industry a lesson on bias. Silence, the strongest weapon of wisdom, on morning shows. Anchors spoke with a mix of sympathy and awe. They all understood there was no better response to contempt than refusing to descend to its level. Online, the world divided in two. Half praised Lan Tran as a symbol of grace and composure in the face of prejudice. The other half questioned her silence. If she really was the CEO, why didn't she speak up sooner? Could this all be a PR stunt? Prejudice, even when exposed, never truly disappears, it just changes form, hiding behind questions that sound harmless. But Lan didn't react. No press conferences, no posts, no interviews. She still came to the office, still met with staff, Still signed executive orders. When a reporter camped outside headquarters called out, "Do you have anything to say to the public?" she simply replied, "I believe the truth has already spoken." A veteran journalist from the Washington Herald wrote in a column, "Lan Tran doesn't need a microphone." Her actions echo louder than any defense. In a world where everyone wants to speak, the one who chooses silence is the one truly listening. The piece went viral, not for its eloquence, but because it reminded people of something they'd forgotten: the quiet strength of dignity. At a small cafe in Chicago, two elderly men rewatched the video on a phone. One said softly, "If it were me, I'd have yelled." The other nodded, replying, "So would I. But maybe that's why I've never made anyone feel ashamed of their own behavior." That line, simple as it was, captured Lan's philosophy perfectly. Justice doesn't exist to win, it exists to awaken. On national television, debates flared. A scholar argued Lan Tran embodies moral leadership. She teaches that true power never needs to prove itself. A host countered, "But if everyone stays silent, won't injustice continue?" The scholar replied, "Not all silence is weakness. Some silences make others hear the sound of their own conscience." And amid thousands of comments, one message was pinned to the top. Justice doesn't need a microphone. It only needs hearts willing to listen. Back at Eclipse Airways headquarters, Nathan Brooks watched the social media dashboard's millions of shares, hundreds of articles, endless debate. He turned to Lan. "Do you want us to release an official statement?" Lan shook her head, eyes fixed on the runway outside, where planes were lifting gracefully into the afternoon sky. "No. People have already found what they needed. Justice isn't something we announce. It's something people see when we stay true to dignity." Nathan nodded. He understood this was no longer about one airline. It had become a mirror, reflecting a society finally realizing that truth doesn't shout, only those who are still enough can hear it. That evening, 60 Minutes aired a special feature about Lan Tran. At the end, the host faced the camera and asked viewers, "If it were you sitting in first class, told you don't belong, would you shout back, or smile and let justice ride the wind?" The question was shared millions of times, not to be answered, but to make people look inward. Lan still didn't appear. She spent the weekend at her small home outside the city, planting flowers and reading as usual. A neighbor asked, "Do you ever get tired of all this attention?" Lan smiled. "No, I'm just grateful that now more people are taking an extra second to truly see each other before they judge." The elderly neighbor nodded. "The world needs more people like you." Lan smiled again, but said nothing because she knew the world didn't need more heroes. It just needed people willing to pause before causing someone pain. In the following weeks, respect in flight became a movement. Airlines launched empathy flight training programs teaching crews to see people before tickets. Law students cited the EA 709 case in essays on social justice. And a group of filmmakers proposed turning the story into a documentary. Eclipse Airways declined all publicity. Lan refused to sell any rights, saying simply, "Don't retell my story. Tell yours, the one where you faced injustice and chose to respond with intelligence instead of anger." 3 months later, Nathan Brooks held Eclipse Airways' first public press conference since the EA 709 incident. Lan sat quietly in the audience, not on stage. Nathan stepped up to the podium and began with a line that silenced the room. "Eclipse Airways hasn't just changed its procedures. We're relearning how to be human." And as he unveiled the company's full-scale reform program, everyone understood justice no longer flies alone. It had finally found its landing place in the heart of the very institution it transformed. 3 months after the Respect in Flight video shook the media, Eclipse Airways held its first official press conference. There were no flashing lights, no grand stage, no PR spectacle, just a modest, softly lit room, draped in the quiet blue of the sky. The same backdrop every airline used, but this time, it meant something different. Clarity after the storm. Nathan Brooks, the co-founder and CEO, stepped up to the podium. No teleprompter, no corporate slogans, only a few folded sheets of paper creased and worn, as if rewritten over and over in the search for the right words. He glanced toward the back row, where Dr. Lan Tran sat quietly, not among the executives, but among the staff. Their eyes met for a brief moment, not seeking approval, but sharing a silent understanding. It was time to act, not just speak. Nathan began, his voice low and steady, less like a CEO, more like a man confessing, "We failed." Not in operations, but in how we saw people. Eclipse Airways forgot that the real value of an airline isn't in leather seats or fine wine, but in the feeling of respect every passenger deserves. He paused, then looked directly into the television cameras. From this day forward, the dignity of our passengers is non-negotiable. Not because it sounds noble, but because without protecting dignity, we have no right to speak of safety. A long silence followed. No applause, because no one mistook this for a celebration. This was a confession, and in that honesty, there was something rare. The humility of an organization that had once thought itself above the clouds. Then Nathan began announcing the reforms. No jargon, no hollow phrasing, just plain words spoken slowly, as if he wanted everyone from first-class attendants to baggage drivers to truly hear. First, we're launching a mandatory training program for every employee from the boardroom to the runway. The program is called Eyes Open, Hearts Wide. It doesn't just teach how to recognize bias, it teaches how to listen to people before judging who they are. Reporters took notes quietly. Some of them, seasoned veterans, looked up now and then, as if realizing this was the first time they'd seen a major corporation talk about ethics without trying to sell anything. Nathan continued. Second, we're establishing an independent ethics committee made up of sociologists, human rights lawyers, and representatives from minority communities. This committee will have full access to company data, the power to review internal reports, and the authority to investigate any complaint without going through executive approval. We want justice to rest, not in the hands of those with power, but in the hands of those with conscience. Lan lifted her gaze slightly. She knew these weren't just Nathan's ideas. They were the result of countless late nights, drafts, and debates, turning morality into a system, not just a sentiment born from scandal. The conference streamed live nationwide. Millions tuned in, not out of curiosity, but because it was rare to see a corporation apologize without shifting blame. In Florida, an elderly woman called her local radio station, her voice trembling. "I don't know much about business," she said, "but I do know this apologizing is easy. Changing is hard. I believe this company, because they're starting again from what's right. Online, the arguments had faded. The hashtag #RespectInFlight still trended, but now it was paired with photos of Eclipse employees in workshops, a flight attendant listening to an elderly passenger's story, a pilot sharing his own experience with bias in the industry. No more viral outrage, just quiet images of people learning how to see each other again. After the conference, Lan slipped out early. She walked down the marble corridor, the afternoon light stretching long across the floor. A young employee hurried up behind her, a former intern, eyes bright, voice trembling. "Dr. Tran, I just wanted to thank you for not walking away that day. If you had, none of us would have learned what we did." Lan stopped, turned, and smiled gently. "Thank you," she said softly, "but don't thank me for staying. Thank yourself for understanding why you should stay when you see something wrong." The young woman nodded, tears glimmering in her eyes. In that moment, justice no longer lived in a CEO's speech. It was breathing quietly in the awareness of one ordinary person. That evening, Nathan texted Lan a single message. "Thank you for teaching me that justice needs a business plan, too." Lan read it and smiled. She knew this was only the beginning. True reform isn't in forming committees. It's in remembering, every day, why you began. She looked out through the glass wall. A plane bearing the Eclipse logo cut across the night sky, its lights blinking steadily calm, sure, balanced. And for the first time in a long while, Lan felt the world imperfect as it was beginning to find its course again. A week after the press conference, Nathan sent Lan an invitation to speak at Eclipse Airways' first full employee assembly since the EA 7009 incident. She hesitated not out of fear, but because she believed words only mattered after actions. Still, she accepted, because some things must be said not to be heard, but to remind everyone that real change doesn't end with policy. It begins in the heart. A week after Eclipse Airways' press conference, the grand conference hall on the 50th floor was filled to capacity. Hundreds of employees had flown in from across the country: pilots, engineers, flight attendants, ground crew. Everyone wanting to hear what the woman who had once silenced the world would say. The air was thick, but not noisy. No banners, no flowers, only soft white light spreading evenly across rows of gray leather seats. On stage stood a simple wooden podium, a single microphone, no screens, no corporate logos, just a small sign that read "Integrity in Flight, Femme Gia Tran Kong." Lan stepped up. No heavy makeup, no commanding suit, just a crisp white shirt and black slacks. So simple she could have been anyone, and somehow that simplicity made the entire room hold its breath. She began, her voice calm, steady. "What happened to me wasn't an exception. It was a symptom of a system, one where people often see each other through standards, not compassion." No one moved, because they knew those words weren't about the past. They were about now. "We've built a world that believes professionalism means never being wrong," she continued. "But I believe true professionalism is having the courage to admit when we are and to change." A few heads nodded. Some eyes welled up, not because she spoke dramatically, but because every word carried the quiet gravity of truth. She paused. Behind her, a photo appeared, not the viral footage, but a still image: Lan sitting in seat 1A, calm in the middle of the storm. No caption, no slogan, just the moment. She looked at it for a second and said, "I don't need apologies. I need action, because an apology without change is just a way to make people comfortable without making them better." A soft wave of air moved through the room, not applause, just silence, heavy with memory. Lan glanced around, her tone lowering but sharpening. "I've heard many say, I don't discriminate against anyone. But the truth is, when you have power and you stay silent in the face of discrimination, you've already chosen a side." The room froze. Many looked down. She wasn't accusing them. She was holding up a mirror, one big enough for everyone to see themselves in it. "When you have power," she said, "use it to protect those who don't. That's the only reason power should exist, not to control, but to shelter, in the front row. Nathan Brooks sat with his hands clasped, eyes thoughtful. He had once told her, "I'll fix this with the very system I built." And now, he was watching his co-founder redefine what power meant. Lan continued, her voice unwavering. "That day, when they asked me to leave the plane for verification, I looked around. I wasn't angry. I saw fear in people's eyes, fear of speaking up, fear of being involved. And I realized this wasn't just an incident on one flight. It was a test to see whether we would choose dignity or the comfort of silence." She paused, smiled faintly, almost to herself. Justice doesn't only come from courts. It comes from ordinary people. The moment they decide their silence is no longer harmless. The entire room went still. No phones, no whispers, no movement. They weren't hearing a speech, they were witnessing a quiet confession from someone who had every right to be bitter, yet chose forgiveness without forgetting. "I'm not here to retell old stories," she said softly. "I'm here because if I, someone with power, could be judged by appearance, imagine how many times those with less power face it every single day." Nathan looked around. A young flight attendant was wiping her eyes. A pilot had his head bowed, fingers interlaced. Hundreds of people each seeing themselves reflected in her calm. Lan's final words came like a benediction, warm, slow. Deliberate change doesn't begin with policy. It begins when each of us chooses to see others as human beings, not as passengers, subordinates, or skin tones. There was a long pause. Then, without anyone prompting, the entire hall rose to its feet, not in applause, but in quiet respect, a standing ovation of conscience. Lan bowed slightly, then stepped down from the podium. She didn't look back. She didn't smile, because for her, a speech was never an ending. It was a reminder that the real journey was just beginning. Outside in the hallway, Nathan was waiting. He said nothing, only handed her a single sheet of paper, the draft for Integrity in Flight, Phase 2. At the top, handwritten in blue ink, were 4 simple words: "Action speaks for truth." Lan read it, nodded quietly. She knew some waves don't roar, but they still change the direction of the wind forever. The next morning, newspapers were filled with photos from the speech, but not of Lan speaking on stage, of her bowing silently as she stepped away. One headline read, "You don't have to shout to be heard. True justice comes from those who stand still and let the truth speak for them." And though the story seemed to have reached its end, for Lan Tran and for Eclipse Airways, it was only the dawn of a new kind of justice, one where silence was no longer fear, but strength. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight spilled through the massive glass facade of Eclipse Airways headquarters, the city was still half asleep. On the 47th floor, the same office that, a year ago, had witnessed the most tense meeting in the company's history, warm light now flooded every corner. "Dr." Lan Tran stood quietly by the window, a cup of tea steaming gently in her hand. Below her, the runway gleamed in the dawn. An Eclipse 99 lifted off, slicing cleanly through the clouds. The distant hum of its engines faded, leaving behind a peaceful hush, the kind that only comes after a storm has passed. On her desk lay a handwritten note, "Integrity in Flight, Chapter 3. People and Trust." Not a business plan, a new training program for the entire organization. She didn't sign it right away. Her pen hovered for a moment, as if she wanted to etch something deeper than a signature, the true meaning of justice. Out in the hallway, Nathan Brooks was speaking softly to a group of young employees. No longer the commanding CEO, now more like a mentor. His voice carried faintly through the glass walls. We can't change the world through policies alone, but we can start by treating the person beside us with fairness. Lan heard him and smiled faintly. She knew the justice they had rebuilt together wasn't written in regulations or courts. It was growing quietly, in moments like that. Her monitor lit up. A new email popped in, subject special flight to Atlanta. It was the flight featuring attorney Angela Price, the woman who had spoken up for Lan that day, now a keynote speaker for the Diversity in Action program. Lan read the event description. Guest speaker, Angela Price, a woman who believes one voice at the right moment can change the entire sky. Her eyes softened, not with pride, but with a kind of quiet awe. The realization that her choice to stay silent that day had rippled outward in ways she could never have predicted. The true strength of justice isn't in conquering, it's in inspiring others to rise. She turned back to her desk and pressed play on a small voice recorder left there since her speech. Her own voice drifted out, calm as a breeze. Whether you're the owner of the airline or just a passenger, your dignity doesn't need anyone's permission. It had been meant as a closing line. Now, it sounded like a declaration not for her alone, but for everyone who had ever been looked down on, excluded, or told they didn't belong. She closed her eyes. The sunlight touched her face, glowing softly against the glass, a reflection not of success, but of clarity. In that stillness lay the story's essence. Justice isn't a light that shines on us from outside. It's the one that glows quietly within those who keep their dignity in the dark. Elsewhere in the building, Marcus, the former head attendant who once checked her ticket, was now leading a new training class. His voice trembled slightly, but it was honest. Back then, I thought I was just following protocol, but now I understand sometimes protocol is how we hide our own prejudice. The room went silent. A young flight attendant raised her hand. "Have you ever seen Dr. Tran again?" Marcus smiled faintly. "Every time I fly above the clouds, I think of that day, and I remind myself justice doesn't need witnesses. It just needs us not to repeat the wrong." No one spoke after that, but in that moment, the lesson of dignity became more than a story. It became the moral foundation of their work. That afternoon, Lan left the office. She carried no folders, only a small notebook. On the first page, written neatly in fountain pen, were 4 words, "The Quiet Justice." Beneath it, a smaller line, "You don't have to shout to be heard." She stepped into the hallway, wind from the high floors brushing her hair. Before her stretched the evening sky, the last golden light of day spilling over the clouds like a warm blanket. She watched a plane descend and whispered, barely audible, but meant for herself, "Courage isn't only resistance. Courage is standing still and not falling." In that moment, there was no CEO, no symbol, just a human being, standing in the light, calm, grounded, unbroken. And as she turned away, her figure dissolved into the brightness as if justice itself had become part of the sky, silent but eternal. On every flight, thousands of people carry luggage, fears, and even prejudice. But among them are those who carry hope, the belief that the world can be kinder if someone dares to begin. And sometimes, that someone doesn't need to shout, doesn't need to fight. They only need to hold their dignity long enough for truth to rise. Justice isn't about winning. It's about how we treat others when no one's watching. The final beam of sunlight streamed through the window, falling across Lan's face as she smiled a soft, weightless smile. Not the triumph of a victor, but the quiet grace of someone who chose wisdom over anger, dignity over revenge. Outside, a plane lifted into the open sky. Across its tail gleamed the words Eclipse Airways, flying with dignity. And beneath it, smaller, like a whisper carried by the wind, the sky remembers. There are moments in life when people will doubt you, look down on you, maybe even say, "You don't belong here." But the story of Dr. Lan Tran reminds us of one simple truth. Dignity never needs anyone's permission. True justice isn't about winning an argument. It's about staying calm when others try to drag you down. When Lan chose silence instead of reacting, she wasn't weak, she was strong, because she let truth speak louder than pride. From that first-class seat on a single flight, a lesson echoed across the world. We can't control how others treat us, but we can control how we respond. We can choose anger, or we can choose wisdom. We can choose revenge, or we can choose to let justice work through integrity and compassion. In the end, Lan didn't just change an airline. She changed the way people saw each other. And maybe that's the real power, using power to give others a chance, not to reclaim your own. If this story touched you, if you believe that silence isn't weakness, but a form of wisdom and justice, hit like, share, and subscribe to join us in spreading more stories like this. One stories that don't shout, but quietly remind us to stop and see the world with a more open heart. Thank you for watching, and remember, dignity is the one thing no one can take from you unless you give it away.